The spotlight was on Ace Frehley. 20,000 people were screaming his name. He was in the middle of his signature solo, fingers flying across the fretboard of his smoking Les Paul, when he saw something that made him stop playing mid-note. The arena went silent. The band looked at each other in confusion. Gene Simmons stepped forward, thinking something had gone wrong with Ace's equipment. But Ace wasn't looking at his guitar. He was staring at a sign in the front row. A handmade poster board covered in glitter and desperate handwriting that read, "Please Ace. This is Tommy's last wish. He's dying." It was June 23, 1979, at the Capitol Center in Landover, Maryland. Kiss was in the middle of their Dynasty tour, playing to sold-out arenas across America. The show had been flawless so far. The pyrotechnics were exploding on cue, the platform boots were stomping in perfect rhythm, and Ace had just launched into his extended solo during "Shock Me," the song he'd written, the song he sang, the song that was supposed to be his moment to shine. But now the music had stopped. The only sound in the massive arena was the confused murmur of 20,000 people wondering what was happening. Tommy Richards was 12 years old and he was dying. Not someday in the distant future. Not if things went wrong. He was dying right now, slowly, painfully, inevitably. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The doctors had given him 6 months when they'd first diagnosed him 14 months ago. He'd already outlived their prediction, but his body was finally giving up. The chemotherapy had stopped working 3 weeks ago. His parents had been told to start thinking about hospice care, about making him comfortable, about saying goodbye. Tommy had been a Kiss fan since he was 7 years old. His older brother Mark had introduced him to the band, playing "Rock and Roll All Night" on his bedroom stereo until their mother threatened to throw the record player out the window. But for Tommy, it wasn't just noise. It was magic. For superheroes in makeup and costumes, playing music that made him feel powerful when everything else in his life made him feel small. The Demon. The Star Child. The Catman. And his favorite, the Spaceman. Ace Frehley was Tommy's hero. Not because of the makeup or the costume, but because of the way he played guitar. Tommy had been taking guitar lessons for 2 years before the diagnosis, practicing every day after school, dreaming of the day he'd be good enough to play like the Spaceman. When the cancer came, the guitar became even more important. On days when the chemotherapy made him too sick to get out of bed, he'd hold his guitar across his chest, not playing, just holding it, feeling the weight of it, the solid reality of the wood and strings reminding him he was still here, still alive. His parents, David and Carol Richards, had watched their son's body deteriorate over the past 14 months. The bright, energetic boy who used to run through the backyard pretending to be a rock star had become a thin, pale ghost who could barely walk from his bedroom to the bathroom without needing to rest. His hair had fallen out from the chemotherapy. His skin had taken on a yellow tint that the doctors said meant his liver was struggling. His arms were covered in bruises from all the blood draws and 4 lines. But through it all, Tommy had never lost his love for Kiss. He had every album, every poster, every magazine article. His hospital room had been decorated with Kiss memorabilia, transforming the sterile white walls into a rock and roll shrine. The nurses had grown accustomed to hearing Kiss albums playing softly from the portable record player David had brought in. Some of them had even started to recognize the songs. 3 months ago, when Tommy had been readmitted to the hospital for another round of aggressive treatment, one of his nurses, a woman named Janet who had a teenage son of her own, had asked him what he wanted to do more than anything else in the world. Tommy's answer had been immediate and certain. "I want to see Kiss live. I want to see Ace Frehley play guitar in person. Just once." Janet had mentioned it to David and Carol that evening. They'd nodded, tried to smile, knowing it was impossible. Kiss tickets were expensive, and they'd already spent everything they had on Tommy's medical bills. Their insurance covered most of the treatment, but there were always additional costs. Experimental medications. Special tests. Travel to specialists. They were drowning in debt, working double shifts whenever they could, taking any overtime available. Concert tickets, especially front-row tickets, were a fantasy they couldn't afford. But Janet hadn't forgotten. She'd gone home that night and told her husband about Tommy. She'd called her sister, who knew someone who worked at a radio station. She'd started making phone calls, sending letters, reaching out to anyone who might be able to help. And somehow, through a chain of connections and kindness, she'd managed to get in touch with someone who knew someone who worked for Kiss's management company. The response had come back 2 weeks later. Kiss was playing the Capitol Center on June 23. There were 2 tickets waiting for Tommy and 1 parent at will call. Front row, center stage. Courtesy of the band. When Janet had told the Richards family, Carol had broken down crying right there in the hospital hallway. David had had to sit down, his legs suddenly unable to support him. And Tommy, laying in his hospital bed, too weak to even sit up without help, had smiled wider than his parents had seen him smile in months. But there had been a problem. June 23 was 5 weeks away, and the doctors weren't sure Tommy would live that long. His condition was deteriorating rapidly. The cancer had spread to his lungs, his brain, his bones. He was in constant pain, even with the morphine they were giving him. The doctors had gently suggested that the family might want to start planning for the worst, might want to gather relatives to say their goodbyes. Tommy had other plans. He'd told his mother, in a voice so weak she'd had to lean close to hear him, "I'm going to that concert, Mom. I'm going to see Ace play. I'm not dying before then." And somehow, impossibly, he'd hung on. He'd fought through infections that should have killed him. He'd survived complications that made the doctors shake their heads in disbelief. He'd willed himself to stay alive through sheer determination and the promise of one night, one concert, one chance to see his hero. The night of June 23 arrived. Tommy weighed 73 pounds, 40 pounds less than he'd weighed at his last birthday. He couldn't walk without assistance. He couldn't eat solid food anymore. But he was alive, and he was going to that concert. David had borrowed a wheelchair from the hospital. Carol had dressed Tommy in his favorite Kiss t-shirt, the one with Ace's face on it, the one that now hung off his skeletal frame like a tent. They'd carefully placed a Kiss hat on his head to cover where his hair had been. Getting Tommy to the Capitol Center had been an ordeal. Every bump in the car had caused him pain. The noise and crowds of the venue had been overwhelming. But when they'd finally reached their seats, right in the front row, close enough to see the stage clearly, close enough to maybe, possibly, be noticed by the band, Tommy had looked at his parents with tears streaming down his hollow cheeks and said, "Thank you. Thank you for getting me here." Carol had made the sign that morning. She'd known it was a long shot, knew that the band probably wouldn't see it, probably wouldn't care even if they did. Rock stars played to thousands of people every night. What was one dying kid to them? But she'd made it anyway, covering the poster board in silver glitter that reminded her of Ace's makeup, writing in the biggest, boldest letters she could manage, "Please Ace. This is Tommy's last wish. He's dying." The concert had started and Tommy had been transfixed. Even though the noise was painful, even though the flashing lights hurt his sensitive eyes, even though he was so weak he could barely hold his head up, he'd watched every second with an intensity that broke his parents' hearts. This was what he'd stayed alive for. This was the dream that had kept him fighting. And then, 23 minutes into the show, during "Shock Me," during Ace Frehley's solo, the moment had come. Carol had held up her sign, not really expecting anything, just wanting to try, wanting to let Tommy feel like they'd done everything they could. And Ace had seen it. The music stopped. Gene Simmons, in full demon makeup and costume, walked over to Ace, concerned. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice carrying in the suddenly silent arena. Paul Stanley stepped up to his microphone. "Everything okay, Ace?" Ace didn't answer them. He walked to the edge of the stage, his silver makeup catching the spotlights, and pointed directly at Tommy. "You," he said, his voice echoing through the massive sound system. "The kid in the Kiss shirt. What's your name?" Tommy tried to answer but his voice was too weak. David leaned down. "Tommy," his father called out. "His name is Tommy." Ace knelt down at the edge of the stage, bringing himself to eye level with Tommy. Even from several feet away, he could see how sick the boy was. The hollow eyes, the skeletal frame, the yellow tint to his skin. Ace had seen enough suffering in his life to recognize it immediately. This kid wasn't just sick. This kid was at the end. "Tommy," Ace said, and his voice was gentler now, stripped of the theatrical rock star bravado. "Is that true? What the sign says?" Carol held up the poster again, her hands shaking. Ace read it again, slower this time, letting the words sink in. "Please, Ace. This is Tommy's last wish. He's dying." 20,000 people were watching this moment unfold. Some of them had pulled out cameras. Most of them were simply silent, sensing that they were witnessing something beyond a normal concert moment. The other members of Kiss had gathered at the front of the stage now, looking down at the thin boy in the wheelchair who had somehow stopped their entire show. "How old are you, Tommy?" Ace asked. 12, David answered when Tommy couldn't summon the strength. "He's 12. He has leukemia. The doctors say he only has a few weeks left." Ace was quiet for a long moment. His bandmates were watching him, waiting to see what he would do. The production crew backstage was frantically trying to figure out if they should restart the music, cut to a commercial break for the live recording, something. But Ace ignored all of them. "Tommy," he said, "do you play guitar?" Tommy nodded, the smallest movement of his head. "What kind of guitar do you have?" "Stratocaster," Tommy whispered, the word barely audible even with the microphone picking up their conversation. Ace smiled, a real smile that had nothing to do with the persona of the spaceman. "Good choice. That was my first guitar too." He stood up and turned to one of the roadies standing in the wings. "Bring me an acoustic." The roadie hesitated for a second, confused, then ran backstage. The arena was still silent, still waiting. Gene walked over to Ace. "What are you doing?" he asked quietly. "I'm playing for that kid," Ace said. "Ace, we've got a show to do. We've got a set list, a production schedule." "I don't care," Ace interrupted, and there was something in his voice that made Gene stop arguing. "Look at him, Gene. Really look at him. That kid is dying and he used whatever energy he had left to come here tonight. The least I can do is play him a song." The roadie returned with an acoustic guitar. Ace took it, checked the tuning with a few quick strums, and sat down on the edge of the stage, letting his legs dangle over the side. He was now only about 6 feet from Tommy, close enough to see the tears streaming down the boy's face, close enough to see Carol gripping her son's hand like she was afraid he might slip away right there. "This one's for you, Tommy," Ace said. And he started to play. He didn't play "Shock Me" or any of Kiss's hits. He played something softer, something acoustic and gentle. It was a melody he'd been working on, something he'd never recorded, never performed publicly. It was slow and sweet and heartbreaking, each note carefully chosen, each chord progression building on the last. His fingers moved across the strings with a tenderness that seemed impossible from someone known for pyrotechnic-fueled rock anthems. The Capitol Center, a massive arena built for sporting events and rock concerts, a space designed to hold noise and chaos and energy, became completely silent except for Ace's guitar. 20,000 people barely breathed, afraid any sound might disturb the moment. Even the production crew had stopped moving, the cameras still rolling but the operators standing motionless behind them. Ace played for Tommy, but he was also playing for himself. He thought about his own childhood, his own struggles, the times he'd felt powerless and afraid. He thought about how music had saved him, given him purpose, given him a way to express things he couldn't put into words. And now, Here was this kid who'd found the same salvation in music, who'd connected to the guitar the same way Ace had, and he was dying. When Ace finished the song, the final note hanging in the air and slowly fading, Tommy was crying openly. Not from sadness, but from overwhelming emotion, from the realization that his hero, the spaceman, Ace Frehley, had just played a private concert for him in front of 20,000 people. "Thank you," Tommy said, his voice cracking. Ace set down the acoustic guitar and picked up his electric Les Paul, the one with the smoking neck that had become his trademark. "I'm not done yet," he said. He turned to his band. "We're going to play Beth," he announced. Peter Criss, the drummer who sang the ballad, looked surprised. Beth wasn't on the set list for tonight. It was Peter's song, the tender, piano-driven ballad that stood out among Kiss's harder rock catalog. But Peter understood immediately what Ace was doing. He nodded and moved to his drum kit. "This is going to be different tonight," Ace said to the arena, his voice echoing through the sound system. "Tonight, Tommy's going to help us play it." David and Carol looked at each other in confusion. Tommy was too weak to even stand, let alone play. But Ace was already motioning for the roadies to bring Tommy's wheelchair onto the stage. "Can we bring him up?" Ace asked, looking at David and Carol. Carol's first instinct was to say no, to protect her son, to avoid any situation that might exhaust him further. But then she looked at Tommy's face and saw an expression she hadn't seen in months, pure joy. "Yes," she said. "Yes, bring him up." Two roadies carefully lifted Tommy, wheelchair and all, onto the stage. The arena erupted in applause, a thunderous sound that seemed to shake the building. Tommy looked out at the massive crowd, at all these people cheering for him, and for a moment his illness didn't matter. For a moment he wasn't a dying 12-year-old. He was a rock star. Ace knelt beside the wheelchair. "I'm going to play the solo," he said to Tommy, "and I want you to feel it, okay? Just close your eyes and feel the music." Tommy nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. Ace positioned himself next to the wheelchair, his guitar at the ready. Peter counted off, and Kiss began to play Beth. Peter's voice, tender and vulnerable, filled the arena. The song, always emotional, took on a new weight tonight. Every person in the Capitol Center knew what they were watching. They were watching a dying boy's last wish come true. They were watching a rock band become something more than entertainers. They were watching humanity break through the spectacle. When Ace's solo came, he didn't showboat. He didn't do his usual theatrical moves or flash his trademark grin. He played from somewhere deep and genuine, each note deliberately chosen to convey something words couldn't express. And he played it directly to Tommy, leaning close to the wheelchair, making sure the boy could not just hear the music but feel it, feel the vibrations of the strings, feel the emotion behind each note. Tommy had his eyes closed, tears streaming down his face, his frail body swaying slightly to the music. Carol and David were standing just off stage, holding each other, both crying, watching their son experience something they'd thought he'd never have. Around the arena, there wasn't a dry eye. Grown men who'd come to bang their heads and throw devil horns were wiping away tears. Women were openly sobbing. Even the hardened members of the road crew, people who'd seen 1,000 concerts and thought nothing could surprise them anymore, were moved. When the song ended, the arena erupted again, but it was different from the typical concert applause. It was cathartic, emotional, a collective release of feeling. Ace set down his guitar and put his hand on Tommy's shoulder. "You're a warrior, Tommy," he said. "You're braver than any of us on this stage." Tommy opened his eyes and looked at Ace. "Can I ask you something?" he whispered. "Anything," Ace replied. "Can I touch your guitar?" Ace didn't hesitate. He took off his Les Paul, the guitar that was worth thousands of dollars, the custom-built instrument that was one of his most prized possessions, and placed it gently in Tommy's lap. Tommy's thin hands, trembling from weakness and emotion, touched the strings, felt the weight of the instrument, ran his fingers across the frets that Ace's fingers had just been dancing across. "It's perfect," Tommy said. Ace smiled. "You keep fighting, Tommy. You keep that warrior spirit. And you keep playing guitar, you hear me? Even if it's just in your mind, you keep playing." The roadies carefully lifted Tommy back down to his parents. As they were lowering the wheelchair, Ace called out, "Wait." He grabbed a guitar pick from his pocket, one he'd been using during the show, and pressed it into Tommy's hand. "For you," he said. "So you remember tonight." "I could never forget," Tommy replied. Kiss finished their show that night, but the energy had fundamentally changed. Every song felt more important, more meaningful. The audience was more engaged, more present. They'd all been part of something that transcended entertainment. They'd witnessed compassion, connection, the power of music to bridge the gap between rock stars and dying children, between theatrical performance and raw human emotion. After the show, Ace arranged for Tommy and his parents to come backstage. The other members of Kiss were there, Gene and Paul and Peter, all of them out of character now, just four guys from New York who'd built an empire on spectacle but had been reminded tonight of why they'd started playing music in the first place. They talked with Tommy for over an hour, far longer than they'd spent with any VIP meet and greet. They signed his t-shirt, his hat, the poster Carol had made. They took photos, made jokes, treated Tommy not like a sick kid but like a fellow musician, someone who understood what it meant to love rock and roll with your whole heart. Before they left, Ace gave Tommy something else. A cassette tape, unmarked except for Ace's handwriting on the label. "These are some songs I've been working on," he said. "Nobody's heard them yet. I want you to have them. Maybe they'll inspire you." Tommy clutched the tape like it was the most valuable thing in the world. Because it was. Tommy Richards died 6 weeks later, on August 7, 1979. He was at home, in his own bed, surrounded by his family. The hospice nurses said he'd been peaceful at the end, that he'd gone gently. On his chest, clutched in his hands, was the guitar pick Ace had given him. On his bedside table was the cassette tape, which he'd listened to dozens of times in his final weeks. And on his face, his parents swore, was a small smile. At Tommy's funeral, the family played Kiss songs. They displayed photos from that night at the Capitol Center, images of Tommy on stage with Ace, images of him smiling wider than he'd smiled in over a year. The service wasn't sad. It was a celebration of a boy who'd fought harder than anyone had the right to expect, who'd survived long enough to see his dream come true, who'd left the world knowing he'd been seen, valued, and loved by his hero. Carol and David Richards had Ace Frehley's guitar pick from that night framed alongside the photo of Tommy on stage. It hangs in their living room today, 43 years later. They've never tried to sell it, despite receiving offers from Kiss collectors who'd pay thousands for an authenticated piece from Ace's Dynasty tour. It's not for sale. It never will be. Ace Frehley kept his promise in a way Tommy's parents never expected. Every year on June 23, wherever he was performing, whatever band he was with, whether it was a Kiss reunion or a solo show, Ace would pause and tell Tommy's story. Not all of it, just the essentials. A kid who was dying. A dream he had to see Kiss live. A moment when music was more important than the show. "This one's for Tommy Richards," Ace would say. And he'd play that acoustic melody he'd written that night, the one that had never been officially recorded, the one that existed only in the memories of the 20,000 people who'd been at the Capitol Center that June evening and in the hearts of everyone who'd heard the story since. The story spread through the Kiss fan community over the years. People who'd been at that show would tell their friends, their children, their grandchildren about the night Kiss stopped mid-concert for a dying boy. Some of them remembered the details differently, as memories do over time, but they all remembered the feeling of it, the sense that they'd witnessed something that mattered more than any pyrotechnic display or theatrical costume. In 1996, when Kiss reunited with the original lineup for their massive reunion tour, a reporter asked Ace about his most memorable moment with the band. Without hesitation, he said, "Tommy Richards. Capitol Center. 1979, that kid taught me more about courage in 10 minutes than I'd learned in my entire life." Playing for him wasn't about being a rock star. It was about being a human being. Carol Richards, now in her late 70s, still goes to Kiss concerts when they come near Maryland. She doesn't try to meet the band anymore, doesn't seek special access. She just buys a ticket, usually not even front row, and sits in the audience like everyone else. But every time she's there, she brings that framed guitar pick, holds it during the show, and remembers the night her son got to live his dream. In 2014, 35 years after Tommy's death, Carol was at a Kiss show at the Verizon Center in Washington, D.C. During the concert, Ace had spotted her in the crowd. He'd recognized her, somehow, after all these years. He'd stopped mid-song, pointed at her, and said, "Tommy's mom is here tonight, folks." Carol Richards. "Tommy, wherever you are, buddy, we're still playing for you." The entire arena had turned to look at Carol, and they'd started applauding. Not the polite applause of a concert crowd, but a standing ovation that lasted for several minutes. Carol had stood there, tears streaming down her face, holding up that framed guitar pick, and felt her son's presence more strongly than she had in decades. After the show, Ace had found her again. He'd given her another gift, a guitar, a real one, a Stratocaster just like Tommy had told him he owned all those years ago. "I think Tommy would want you to have this," Ace had said. "Maybe you can donate it to a music program, help another kid find what Tommy found in music." Carol did exactly that. She donated the guitar to the children's hospital where Tommy had spent so much of his final months, to their music therapy program. The guitar came with a plaque, in memory of Tommy Richards, who taught us that dreams are worth fighting for. From Ace Frehley and Kiss. The guitar is still there today, in the hospital's music room, played by sick children who need something to hold on to, something to fight for, something to remind them that they're more than their illness. None of them know the full story of Tommy Richards. But they play that guitar, and somehow, through it, Tommy's courage keeps echoing forward. Music has power beyond entertainment. It connects us to moments, to people, to versions of ourselves we didn't know existed. That night at the Capitol Center in 1979, Ace Frehley reminded 20,000 people of that truth. He reminded himself of it too. The spaceman, the theatrical character with the silver makeup and smoking guitar, had paused and let Paul Daniel Frehley, the human being, step forward and do something that mattered. Tommy Richards lived 12 years, 11 months, and 3 days. Most of that time was ordinary, unremarkable, the normal life of a normal kid. But for one night, for those precious moments on stage at a Kiss concert with his hero playing guitar just for him, Tommy Richards was exactly where he was meant to be, experiencing exactly what he was meant to experience. And that night, that moment, became more than memory. It became legend, testament, proof that sometimes, when everything else falls away, what matters most is simple human kindness and the willingness to stop, really stop, and see the person in front of you. If this story moved you, if you've ever been touched by unexpected kindness or witnessed the power of music to change lives, share this with someone who needs to know that heroes exist not because of what they can do, but because of what they choose to do. Have you ever had a moment where a stranger's compassion changed everything? Tell your story. Keep Tommy's memory alive. Subscribe for more true stories about when rock stars became more than entertainers, they became healers, witnesses, proof that in our darkest moments, someone might notice, someone might care, someone might stop the show just for us.